Good morning, Your Excellency, Professor Dr. Shanto Marif, of BNPB, Your Excellency Koichi Byoshi, Ambassador of Japan to ASEAN, of course, our friend Dr. Toshi Nishimura, Executive Director of AREA. Good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here on this first ASEAN-Japan Symposium on disaster management. We reached a milestone in Sendai. And as you know, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2016-2030 really represents the latest intergovernmental framework that replaces the 2005-2015 Global Framework for Action. But as expected, there are a number of contested issues covering multilateral bilateral cooperation, technological transfer, and alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as with the climate change processes. So it is true that the value of this workshop will be in further exploring those blind spots, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss such aspects, and especially those which were not fully covered, or particularly highlighted by the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So the significance of the ASEAN, for ASEAN, of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is really in a number of areas. We've come out of Sendai truly inspired, and because it has promoted disaster risk reduction as an essential element of achieving empowerment and empowering the rural and urban communities. It has put disaster risk reduction and building community resilience at the very top of the development priority. And this is an important milestone achievement of Sendai in itself. Also, what's interesting about Sendai really focused on a number of aspects that have heretofore not been really covered, and that is on displaced persons. Displacement was among the contentious issues in hammering out the SFDRR. The importance of participation of internally displaced peoples in decisions affecting them, as highlighted throughout the guiding principles, specifically acknowledged in the framework, by stressing that disaster risk reduction requires empowerment and inclusive, accessible, and non-discriminatory participation, paying special attention to people disproportionately affected by disasters. So this is truly one of the important elements that are now enshrined in the Sendai framework. Another area, and that's more or less the process, is how inclusive Sendai has been, and that is in terms of the role of civil society organizations. It's really one of the significant feats of Sendai, that it raised the bar of such a international cooperation in the inclusion of CSOs, which really participated in the negotiations, in the multi-stakeholder dialogues, in the working sessions, in the side events, and CSO forums throughout the conference. And those of us who were there will probably recall how much of almost a carnival atmosphere it had, because there were so many stakeholders were involved. And those were new, particularly new faces. And I think that really has underscored the strength of Sendai, how truly broad this community is. They played an active role, which in some ways also eclipsed regional organizations such as ASEAN. So we went out of there in ASEAN looking at ourselves and maybe suggesting that we look at a more effective role in developing regional DR mechanisms. And we need to also, in ASEAN, think deeply about having close relationships with regional representatives of the so-called major groups, a platform that was created under the Sendai framework. So ASEAN will need to have a global outreach to assume a leadership and advocacy role for the affirmation of the regional mechanism, something that is not as underscored during the Sendai discussions. Sendai, of course, was also somewhat of a missed opportunity. I'm saying this because I think this workshop, as I said earlier, really has a value in trying to bridge those missed opportunities. And one of the missed opportunities was that it really was expected to be, Sendai was expected to be a precursor for the upcoming post-2015 development agenda. But in some ways, some voices have suggested that it really fell short of these objectives, and there were no clear synergies with other post-2015 development processes. There was limited reference of drivers of disasters, to the drivers of disasters, including climate change, shifting financial resources to investments in disaster risk reduction. I think this is an important a message that at least was brought home to me in Sendai, that is, we have yet to move the bias of putting investments in disaster response and relief rather than to disaster risk reduction investments, which is, I think, a message that was not very clear in Sendai. There are a number of other areas that were perhaps not covered by Sendai, and I do hope that this workshop will be that opportunity. But this workshop is all about building community resilience, and so we have built quite a sufficient amount of knowledge and experience in community resilience. And here in Indonesia, we've seen some tremendous activities, some tremendous best practices that I'm sure the Indonesian government and colleagues here will be able to share here with us. But it really is about looking at our national platforms, and this is not just of Indonesia, but of the ASEAN member states as well, looking at increasing financial investments in disaster risk reduction, looking at increasing support to local authorities, and including elderly, children, youth, women, and persons with disabilities. These are some of the aspects and elements of community resilience that we need to be looking at. Capacity building, looking at financial mechanisms where local community organizations can access funds, and to develop mechanisms that can provide some incentives to the private sector to integrate disaster risk reduction in the way they do business. To continue and strengthen the implementation of the safe schools, stopping the practice of using schools just as disaster evacuation centers, which are actually affecting the quality of education as we suspend school activities during these systems. So we need to be looking at using schools, bringing up the Safer Schools initiatives to do what they do best, and that is to provide a continuing and uninterrupted educational experience for our children. So in ASEAN, just to wrap up my thought on this, to share with you, is that we do have an evolving recovery and resilience approach. And that has really been fronted by our experience in Typhoon Haiyan, or Typhoon Yolanda, as we call it in the Philippines. In ASEAN, we have developed what we call the ASEAN Strategic Assistance for Recovery and Rehabilitation for Typhoon Haiyan affected areas, or AREA. And that is a project that is being implemented by ASEAN through the ASEAN Development Fund. So this is really one of the first experience that we've had in post-recovery efforts. ASEAN has been very much involved in disaster relief and emergency response, but this is a phase in our work in disaster management, where headed by our colleague and friend here, Dr. Zaid Faisal, the AHA Center has really been putting a lot of effort into shifting that momentum, shifting that mindset from emergency response and rehabilitation to recovery, and that linkage with sustainable development. So the AREA program, which is still ongoing, is really looking at working with local government, municipalities, in which we are trying to seize this so-called post-disaster golden window opportunity to build back better, safer, and smarter through resilient recovery planning. We're also trying to enhance disaster resilience by reducing existing vulnerabilities and strengthen local capacities to cope with future hazard events. And thirdly, and more importantly, is to operationalize the Build Back Better, Face Faster and Safer principle, which is adopted by the government of the Philippines to guide high and effective areas and how to bounce forward, not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. So this is the message that I think this workshop will hold on to, which is that community resilience really is something that has been evolving. But at the same time, there are many examples of tremendous effort by our communities, large and small. And they have been pushed also by technological innovations, whether through crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, which has allowed another form of mobilizing resources and to truly include the community. So I do hope that at the end of this workshop we'll be able to really not just share our experiences, but to make this into a very transformative experience that will allow us to work and build beyond Sendai and develop the relationship that we need with our communities. Thank you very much.